Well. It seems that I made some of you sufficiently mad with my previous video. I was hoping that I got a few more dislikes so I could get to 50% and say, perfectly balanced, as all things should be. But, it is what it is. I think that I definitely messed up. And for a lot of you that just found my channel and this being the first video you saw, you didn't understand the point of the video. You don't know why I made it. You don't even know who I am. So let's back up a little bit and let me introduce myself. So my channel name obviously is Scrub God Rs. You can just call me Rs. I have been a gacha player since 2016. Prior to this, over 6 years ago, I was an anime commentator. My primary channel had around 2,000 subscribers. This is not the first time that I've made people mad on the internet over some pixels on the screen, and it won't be the last. I have nearly 900 days logged on HSR completely free to play. I am not a theory crafter, and I chose to be free to play in HSR intentionally to see if my experience that I had accrued across nearly a decade of play would allow me to reach the highest levels of in-game clearance using a methodology that I ended up settling on and I will describe later. For reference, I have spent over $5,000 on gacha games, and almost every time that I've spent money on them, I end up quitting them because they become too easy for me. Now, this video is going to be broken into three parts. The first is my origins, which is extremely important. This context is sort of required to understand my perspective. If you're going to skip it in this entirety, this video is not for you. I would recommend that you click off now. I will then be replying to comments and Q&A, and then also provide a more detailed explanation of why I do not highly value Tribbie, why I do not trust her, and why I believe that for most players, she was not a worthwhile investment. Now, what I am not trying to do with this video is I am not going to argue or debate with you. I am not seeking your approval. I am not seeking your validation. I am not seeking your blind loyalty to my beliefs. I am only seeking your understanding. Without understanding, the points that I make will either A, irritate you, or B, infuriate you. If you take what I say personally, that means the shoe fits, and that's on you. Additionally, if you ask me a question that I already answered in the video, I'm disregarding it. I'm not regurgitating information that took me nearly a week to type, record, and then edit together because you couldn't be asked to use timestamps. Now, with that out the way, let me explain how we got to the Tribbie video in the first place. But first, we have to go back to where we started. So, without this context, the purpose of the Tribbie video will be absurdly unclear. So I'm going to tell you one of many stories about how I directly challenged how the community viewed a unit. So everything started over 2 years ago when I made a video called Honkai Star Rail, Bailu is S tier. Now, why did I make that video? It was pretty simple. Because theory crafters, guide makers, and the community were, from my perspective, disrespecting Bailu and underestimating her value. Some of them were specifically saying that Natasha was a better sustain than Bailu, all because Bailu didn't have a cleanse and Natasha did. Furthermore, when Lynx came out, HSR players were saying that she also power crept Bailu. Why? Again, because of the cleanse. I believe that Bailu was superior and will remain superior long into the future. Now, nearly 3 years later, Bailu can still soul sustain all in-game content, including against the devastating power of Lygus, a boss so powerful that you can only comfortably clear with Hyacine, the strongest healer in the game. Where are Natasha and Lynx in in-game content now? Nowhere to be found. So how did I know that Bailu was going to outlast Natasha and Lynx? Simple. Experience and kit analysis. Natasha and Lynx's soul sustain qualities were always questionable, whereas Bailu, even against heavy crowd control and damage over time, could brute force content. This is due to the scaling of her healing, her damage reduction, small HP buffs, reactive healing, and her free revive at E0. As you can imagine, these qualities are relevant more than ever because cleansing is meaningless if your team is dead, even more so since no one can dodge in this game. Now, an important note, is that it took most of the community well over a year to start acknowledging Bailu's value as a pure healer. The narrative that she was worse than Natasha and Lynx harmed her reputation to the point that most players thought she was utterly useless and would become, and I quote, the Chi-Chi of HSR. And for those that have never played Genshin, Chi-Chi is quite literally considered the most useless standard banner character in the history of that game. Her reputation only started turning around marginally in late 2023 thanks to Global Certified, and more recently thanks to Mr. Pokey. Mr. Pokey hyping up Bailu is also just super ironic given that he was known to curse people's 50-50 with Bailu for well over a year. Most of her reputation recovered on its own now, and that's because new content demands the best pure healing in the game, something that Bailu provides in spades. Now, why does this story matter? Because after constantly challenging large-scale community narratives like the one that plagued Bailu, I grew tired of what I viewed as harmful narratives that would pop up over and over and over again just for the community to realize that they were overzealous and arrogant, whether it be 6 months later, a year later, or in Bailu's case, 2 years later. These narratives often come about because players will take the facts presented to them by theory crafters slash guide makers and over extrapolate. As an example, a theory crafter might say, Tribbie is Castorice's best in slot right now. This sentence implies a time limit. The community will take that and say Tribbie is the best for Castorice. There is no time limit in that statement, and therefore they over extrapolate it. The reason why I view this as a problem is because it causes players to disregard the value of great units, leading them to misunderstand the value of characters they may have pulled otherwise or invested into under different conditions. I took it upon myself to try and make more videos about these narratives, trying to get people to think differently about the future of characters and this game, to challenge their preconceived notions about this game. It was never enough. So I decided to take it a step further. I had to do something that a rational person would never do. And that was attempt to predict a character's value long into the future. In other words, predict power creep. This is insanity. I know it's insanity, but I still wanted to try. Even if I was treated as a village idiot, even if I ended up being wrong, I still wanted to try. Now, the massive difference between a theory crafter's perspective and my own is that they largely judge a character's value on how good they are prior to a character's release and at the time of release, while briefly discussing the possible futures of those characters. They do this using data, discussing synergies, testing, kit analysis, and calculations. If I had to describe this, I would say that 60 to 70% of their reasoning is based on data, while 30 to 40% is their personal opinion. However, I do believe that this approach does have blind spots, as any approach does, because each theory crafter has their own biases that causes them to value something that a similarly informed theory crafter might dismiss. For me, 30 to 40% of my reasoning is based on data, while 60 to 70% of my reasoning is based on my personal experience slash opinion. Additionally, I judge characters based on how well I expect them to be doing in metas over 1 year into the future. I also plan out my account upwards of 4 to 6 months in advance. Ironically, by doing this, I am forced to over extrapolate myself, as it would be fundamentally impossible to consistently and accurately determine the value of units so far into the future. This is why I'm not seeking to replace or usurp a theory crafter's fact-based methodology. I'm seeking to supplement it. Doing things in this manner is extremely important to me because I cannot afford to invest incorrectly on my account. As a free-to-play, all my resources are extremely limited. As such, every jade matters, and I intend to stretch each one to the upper limits of its value. Usually, but not always, if I don't believe a character will be valuable upwards of 1 to 2 years into the future, either A, I will not fully invest in that character, or B, I will skip them outright. Now, the reason why I don't view my own extrapolation as being that bad is that I'm fully aware that what I'm doing is speculative, and thus I'm very aware that I could be wrong in a lot of cases. When the community over extrapolates, they do it with an irrational confidence, leading them to be surprised or in disbelief when something they should have expected inevitably happens. That's the reason why I brought up the comment from the subscriber on Globa's video, because if you were listening to Globa, he always expressed that Tribbie is a great unit. However, he did believe that there were a lot of flaws with her utility going down the line, and that even though she's great now, he doesn't know if she was going to be great in the future. He never suggested that she was irreplaceable. He never suggested that she was going to be the greatest thing for the next year or so. Only that she was great as of right now with our current options, but that obviously could change later. Now, do my over extrapolations actually work? In my experience, in both short term and long term cases, yes. As a short term example, I knew Castle Rice was coming out 6 months in advance. As such, around December 2024, I stopped pulling entirely. I didn't pull again until April 2025. During the time frame that I didn't pull, my account's average cycle clear in MOC was 4 cycles. Since then, my average cycle clear, with Castoray specifically, is 1.8 cycles. So, I decided to forego all pulling for 105 days because I fully expected her to be a long-term improvement for my account despite having little data to support this assumption. To give you another short-term example, I also pulled for Cipher. I figured I should use this as an example because I'm sure that the Castorized one seems obvious in hindsight. Cipher did not have the same hype as Castorized at all. To put in perspective the sheer difference in faith that the community has in both characters per Star Rail station, Castorized was pulled for 30,966,208 times, whereas Cipher was pulled for 5,162,828 times. In Chinese servers, she is the worst selling HSR unit of all time. It was largely considered that Cipher was an utterly skippable character, especially given the perceived value of Tribbie, the value of Hyacine, and the release of Phynon. Add in the Silverwolf buff and her nerfs in beta, Cipher's future looked bleak. If you're familiar with Genshin lore, she effectively got Yoimia'd. Per all available data, Cipher looked like a skippable character, and that sentiment echoed throughout the community. Despite the data suggesting that pulling Cipher was not a rational option for the overwhelming majority of players, especially given the alternatives, I pulled her anyways. I valued her in ways most did not, for reasons I'll outline later. And to be clear, when I'm seriously pulling for a unit, my vision is not clouded by the words of theory crafters, guide makers, the community, and definitely not any upstarts in my comment section. Once I've made my mind up, my vision is unperturbed by external noise. Now, how did it work out? For me specifically, when Cipher is on a team, the amount of time it takes for me to clear a side of Memory of Chaos, on average, is 1/4 of a cycle. Mind you, this isn't just on Castorized teams. This number includes clears with Fei Xiao at E0S0, Acheron at E0S1, and Jinglu at E1S0. My average Pure Fiction clear time while she's on my team for both sides is 40,000, a perfect score. Again, this data isn't coming purely from Castorized either. My Acheron was capable of 40K'ing Pure Fiction immediately after I pulled her. My average Apocalyptic Shadow clear time while she's on my team for both sides is 1600 AV, meaning a minimum of 3600 points. The only 2 units that I believed and still believe have value upwards of not just 1 year, but 2 years into the future are Ron May and Robin. These are the only 2 units on my account that are E1 S1. Despite Ron May being a 1.x unit and Robin being a 2.x unit, these are the only team-wide buffers that I have continued to use in every in-game mode since their release. That is 640 plus days of value in my high-level clears for Ron May and 507 plus days of value for Robin. For me to pull a replacement or backup team-wide buffer, they must, from my perspective, provide equal or greater value than those units. I hold every team-wide buffer to the standard and precedent that Ron May and Robin have set on my account. Now, how do I enforce my standards? How do I judge every other character? There are many criteria, but these are the primary three: my personal experience as a free to play and as a long term gacha player, the history of metas in HSR as I've observed them, and kit design analysis. Using these three, I attempt to extrapolate the value of the characters that I judge. For me, the value of a character is not based on a character's current strength, but what I believe their potential to be far into the future. In other words, how resistant they are to power creep. Additionally, I am measuring how valuable a character is over options that already exist in the game. For referential purposes only, in real life, this is known as value over replacement, which measures the worth of a player compared to the average replacement at the same position. Again, this is extremely important to me because I know that for free to plays and low spenders, every jade used matters. We cannot afford to make rash investments on our accounts. Doing so is tantamount to account suicide that can easily break our account. We cannot afford to keep pulling every shiny new character just for them to be irrelevant in 6 months. It is literally not sustainable for any free to play. One of the many contributing factors to free to plays and low spenders quitting the game is investing in a character they like or what they think is good, only for a character with 10, 20, or 30% more strength to be released in 6 months of their investment, thus making it seem as if that investment was just invalidated. This is a sentiment that I've noticed while browsing forums, reading comment sections, and listening to content creators venting their frustrations about this game. I hope that providing a differing perspective, I could aid in helping players make informed decisions about characters in a way that guide makers and theory crafters do not. Again, I am not attempting to override the fact based methodology of guide makers and theory crafters, but to be an additional voice to players like me in what is often a chorus of similar opinions. These choruses are inevitable because the best theory crafters are poring over the same data and thus come to similar conclusions about a unit's strength. So, on January 15th, 2025, I uploaded this, the first long running series on my channel, the HSR predictive tier list and pulling recommendations. Now, this was inspired by Pridewin, but an important note, which I end up having to revise over time, always has said that this tier list is predicting where I believe these characters will be rated by the end of version 3.8 and not how good they are currently. All characters are rated at E0S0 except the Trailblazer, who's rated at E6S0. Additionally, the most important difference is that my tier list considers the likelihood of a character withstanding power creep. So, if a character is strong on release, but has flawed kit design or a lack of dedicated support, this tier list aims to predict where they'll be by the end of version 3.8 and all the dust settles. The more resilient to power creep, in addition to the character's strengths, the higher the tiered placement. Now, the reason why I made the Tribbie video was because I had been saying in that series for 9 months that I didn't trust her within those tier lists, and I wanted to explain why. To those that have forgotten or have lost track of what I said thus far, let's recap and connect the dots. I started making content because of narratives disparaging Bailu and characters like her. I tried making videos to better combat those narratives because I viewed them to be harmful to the community. That didn't work, so I took it a step further by directly challenging certain narratives within my own tier list using the same over extrapolation methods used by the community. However, I took my extrapolations to their logical extremes and tested that logic on my own account to test its validity, prior to creating this series. I would continue to test this method during the duration of version 3.x and create in-game content showcasing the results of my methodology. After all, if I don't follow my own logic and produce results, why should anyone else care? By doing so, I hope to give players an alternative perspective that differs from the echo chambers that they had grown accustomed to. Now, the narrative surrounding Tribbie caused me to express my distrust for her and her value in that video. Specifically, I did not believe that she would be a top 1 Harmony unit for very long, and thus her value was questionable at best. I did not believe that she was going to be Castorice's long-term best in slot, and I definitely did not believe that she would end the era of Robin and Naran May. That video seek to further elaborate for my distrust in that character and explain why I don't believe she's as valuable as the community had made her out to be. I fundamentally failed to do so due to incomplete arguments and a failure to provide sufficient context to first-time viewers, and thus I'm making this follow-up video to further explain why I hold these beliefs. Additionally, I believe that I was incredibly too generous to Tribbie in my first video, and that stops here. I'm going to be 100% in my conviction this time. To reiterate, these are the primary ways that I judge units. My personal experience as a free-to-play and a long-term gacha player, the history of metas in HSR as I've observed them, and kit design analysis. Using these three, I attempt to extrapolate the value of the characters I judge. For me, the value of a character is not based on a character's current strength, but what I believe their potential to be far into the future. In other words, how resistant they are to power creep. With all that said, let's move on to the next part of the video. All right, now that we got the intro out the way, we're just going to jump straight into the most liked comment on my video. I'm going to put that up on the screen. I'm just going to jump right into the first question. No, I was studying her kit design under the lens of a Harmony unit as defined by the developers on its own with no other external factors, meaning buffs only. Now, why does this matter? Simple. In order for a Harmony unit to have long-term viability, from my perspective, they must have one or more unique buffs that will allow them to persist at a high level into the future. More on that later. To answer your second question, again, no, because her kit is completely antithetical to her path. Her damage amp is largely irrelevant. That's why I intentionally didn't discuss it in detail. Damage amp is legitimately the worst way to judge a Harmony's value because it's one of the easiest parts of a kit to power creep. Over half of her kit focuses on personal damage, which is also extremely easy to power creep. Because there are more parts of her kit dedicated to her personal damage instead of her amping capabilities have already begun to be power crept. Due to the fact that the majority of her kit is flawed, in that it focuses more on her personal damage than her amping capabilities, she has virtually no room for improvement in the very near future. Historically, the best Harmony units have one or more buffs/abilities that are A, unique to them, B, extremely difficult to replicate in other units, and C, scalable with harder content. Historically, those unique buffs/abilities have less to do with personal damage and damage amping and everything to do with overall utility and team-wide protection. I will provide specific examples later. Now I'll outline some statements and put those up on the screen and directly respond to those. So, in response to your first comment, I already acknowledged in the video that many characters, like Ron May, don't fit into the rigid mold that is their path. Either you didn't hear me say that, or you started typing before I got the chance to. Given that the average view duration of my 30-minute video is less than 2 minutes and 30 seconds, I'm going to assume the latter. The point is that if a unit is going to steer from its traditional purpose, that deviation, logically should do more to make that unit special, not only compared to other units that share its defined role, but to other units that share the exact same abilities. These unique and special abilities, again, should be scalable with content difficulty, hard to replicate, and unique to that unit. Personal damage, as I already pointed out, is extremely easy to power creep, and that's because it's extremely easy to replicate. It's so easy, in fact, that from a sub DPS perspective, Hyacine came out and almost immediately start putting out similar or better numbers than Tribbie at E0. This was quite literally 2 patches later. My questions are then, what was the point of allowing Tribbie to deviate from her role in such a way, only for her sub DPS capabilities to A, be easily power crept by a sustain, and B, be further power crept by a better Castorize / Remembrance support in the same version? And before someone asks me, well, why aren't you complaining about Hyacine? The reason why I'm not complaining about Hyacine is because, at her base, she is still the best pure healer in the game. That is her primary role, and the sub DPS is an addition to that. It makes the character better. However, for Tribbie, the personal damage is over half the kit, and it is not the best feature of that unit. Do you understand the difference? To be clear, power creep at this rate is uncommon. As an example, Ron May's weakness break efficiency didn't start getting power crept until 364 days after her release when Fugue dropped in version 2.7, and that was with vertical investment only. Ron May, to this day, is the only unit that provides 50% weakness break efficiency at E0. The reason why the power creep that occurred to Tribbie is more alarming is because, to reiterate, over half her base kit is dedicated to said personal damage. Personal damage that got power crept immediately. It's not that Tribbie got power crept. I expected that. It's the speed at which the power creep is occurring. This would be like if Bronya was originally a limited 5-star Harmony and Sunday dropped 2 patches later. The closest instances I have ever seen of something like this occurring is when Robin released right after Sparkle or when Jinglu dropped right after D-Hill. For something like this to happen in 2025 to a supposed premium Harmony unit is odd, to say the least. Reminder that one of the biggest glaze sessions for Tribbie is due to her synergy with Hyacine. It is known as the wheelchair comp, a comp best known for its sub DPS output. Evernight has come out and completely eclipsed the original version of that comp. Evernight is massively better for Hyacine than Tribbie ever was. Of course, Tribbie can be used right alongside Evernight and Hyacine, but the biggest problem is that Evernight and Hyacine want each other. Castorice wants them too. None of them want or need Tribbie. Yet, for some reason, members of the community called Evernight bait and skippable despite her superior synergy with the strongest sustain in the game and a top 2 DPS in the game. Simultaneously, those same players will laud Tribbie's personal damage and amp, despite Evernight having a superior amp and damage within Tribbie's most well-known team comp. This blatant hypocrisy astounds me. To address your second statement, as I already stated earlier, I am judging a character's value based on their resistance to power creep. This is critical to determining if I will pull that unit or not, as my resources are extremely limited as a free to play. A 6 to 7 month lifespan as a best in slot and Castorice's team makes Tribbie's value abysmal from my perspective, especially when there are cheaper alternatives that will hold greater long-term value like Ron May and Cipher. My expectations for a character that is supposed to be the top 1 Harmony in the game and Castorice's best in slot is massively higher than most players. As I stated earlier, I am holding Tribbie to the same standard I hold Ron May and Robin. For perspective, as Goba pointed out, Tribbie doesn't have the same value to Castorize that Ron May has to Firefly. Ron May has been the undisputed GOAT of Super Break at E0 for almost 2 years, despite not having the most optimized kit for that archetype. Tribbie is not only not the best HP support in Castorize's team, that would be Hyacine, she's not the best sub DPS either, that would be Evernight. All of this occurring in less than 7 months and in the same version. And soon, she won't be the best amplifier in that comp either. This is one of the most rapid fall offs of any Harmony that has the prestige that Tribbie supposedly has as a best in slot that I have ever seen in nearly 900 days of playing this game. For perspective, this would be like if Ron May released in version 2 and was outright replaced by Fugue and Firefly teams in the same version. Or if Robin was completely replaced in Facial teams by a superior follow-up / attack buffer in the same version. I skipped Tribbie specifically because I have an E1S1 Ron May. My E1S1 Ron May already allows me to do high-level clears. Therefore, for me personally, I have 0 reasons to replace her with Tribbie, even if I got Tribbie E1S1 because of the following. First, Ron May has aged better with time. To be clear, I want to cover Ron May's resume real quick to jog your memory. She was the best team-wide buffer in 1.x, the best Super Break support in 2.x, and then slotted herself into several other comps in 3.x despite her being nearly 2 years old. If players who were around when Ron May came out knew that she would be meta relevant for nearly 2 years, knowing that the shelf life for a unit is 6 to 9 months, what would they think about that value? Just food for thought. Second, replacing Ron May with Tribbie would be negligible to improving my account. I have over 640 plus days with her, along with a recent 3-star clear against Knight 3, plus a 2-star against the King and the new mode, Anomaly Arbitration, to support this. To wrap things up and get to the point, Tribbie's hypothetical VORP, or value over replacement, is negligible in any well-built account. Essentially, just like how Silverwolf was when she came out, Tribbie's value is highest when you have less options to choose from and will become less valuable the more your account and meta evolves. With all that said in laborious detail, along with the context I provided earlier, hopefully you have a better understanding of why I find 6 to 7 months of relevance before getting power crept in a team that she's supposedly best in slot, even with her E1, is a pretty damning condemnation of her value. I'm sure you're all wondering why I didn't bring up her utility in all the other team comps that she's used in, but you'll have to wait for that. Moving on to the next comment, I'm going to put that up on the screen. And then the statement that I'm going to be responding to within that comment. Now, for this comment, I'm going to have to address each of your points from weakest to strongest. This might take a while, so please bear with me. Now, for AOE Chip Damage, my response to that is, seriously? Chip damage? Robin has boasted additional damage that can tick at 20k plus damage a hit and 300 to 500,000 damage a battle back in 2.x. For what reason would I mention that? Nobody pulls Robin primarily for her additional damage. No one pulls Tribbie primarily for her additional damage either. It's nice to have, but not worth seriously acknowledging. For follow-up frequency, unless you're using Tribbie in a Herda, Jade, or Facial team, I see no reason as to why this is something that I should be considering at all. Follow-up frequency serves no practical purpose outside of follow-up / erudition teams. Wasn't worth acknowledging as Globa did that for me. DDD Driver at S0. Now this is one of the funniest arguments that I hear about Tribbie. and the one I've been itching to address the most. She's an amazing DDD jockey, you say. Question. Who in 2025 unironically needs DDD to clear in-game content? It's a legitimate question, by the way, not rhetorical. As a nearly 900-day free-to-play player, I literally just got my SI5 DDD last week and literally did not care. That light cone hasn't been relevant for me since I got Robin and hasn't been relevant for the overwhelming majority of players in over a year. The amount of times that I've used that light cone in the past year, I can count on one hand. Without it, you can still do all the sweaty stuff that you want to do in in-game. Zero cycle, 40k pure fiction, even get 3900 plus clears in Apocalyptic Shadow. But to pretend like DDD moves the needle for the average player in 2025 is ridiculous and utterly irrelevant. It's a nice bonus to have, but a nearly 3-year-old light cone that newer players and even a few older players either A, don't own and can't farm, or B, don't even have an SI3 or higher shouldn't be a selling point for a premium Harmony unit. Ron May has been able to use DDD since 1.x and literally no one cares anymore. Just a fun fact, by the way. 4-star light cones are becoming so increasingly useless with this increasingly harder content that Pridewind is seriously considering rating characters at E0S1 instead of E0S0. Let that marinate. DDD is only relevant now because Tribbie is conveniently good at spamming it. If the developers had it their way and left her kit the way they wanted it back in V1, we wouldn't even be having this discussion. But since we're having this discussion, let's talk about the best DDD spammers from back in version 1. The best one was none other than Tingyun. Back then, she was a top 2 Harmony unit. One of the best in the game. Super accessible, super valuable. In V2, she still had some meta relevance, but it was clear that with the release of Sunday and Huoho, she was going to be seeing a drastic drop in relevance in 3.x. And she did. She's one of the most irrelevant units from a meta perspective, and everyone knows that. Of course, for new players, she's still very much needed and valuable. But the instant new players build out their account within 6 months or so, her value goes right back into the toilet. Now, I'm sure that somebody will point out that Tingyun is still tier 1 in all modes per Pridewind, the same site that I was inspired by and who I look towards for player data. There she is. What a beautiful woman. Anyways, I personally don't understand how she has this rating. I get she has synergy with Saber, Robin, and sustainless clears, etc., but what's her actual clear times look like nowadays? Well, at E2 plus with all light cones, her average clear time is 4.95 cycles in Memory of Chaos, 37,648 points in Pure Fiction, and 3,667 points in Apocalyptic Shadow. Pretty good for such an old 4-star. Then you look at her usage. Not so good. 1.65% in Memory of Chaos, 1.65% in Pure Fiction, and 2.87% in Apocalyptic Shadow. These are known as one-guy numbers or outliers, as in a very small group, usually less than 5% of the aggregated data, of skilled players are artificially boosting the numbers for a specific character due to the small sample size. Now, for some limited 5-star units, these numbers wouldn't surprise me because the average player rarely pulls for units at E2 or higher. But Tingyun is a 4-star that most players can easily E4 to E6 within the first 6 months of playing the game for free. Given that most players own an E2 plus Ting Yun, the data suggests that almost no one uses her, and therefore she is not meta relevant anymore. The next character who I'll be talking about is the Harmony main character. And oh man, in version 2, they were unreal. One of the most free-to-play friendly and utterly broken options in the game. The fact that we were given such a phenomenal unit for free and could E6 with virtually no difficulty should have been another red flag for bad things to come, but that's for another video. They were great, not only for their enabling a super break, but because, you guessed it, they were synergistic with DDD. If Ting Yun was the DDD bot of choice in version 1, then Harmony Trailblazer was a DDD bot of choice in version 2. Now, once again, if you were to refer to Pridewin, you would see that they are Tier 2 in Memory of Chaos, Tier 2 in Pure Fiction, and Tier 1.5 in Apocalyptic Shadow. Hey, that's still considered meta. Once again, though, what's the clear data look like? With E2 Plus and all light cones, we got 3.62 cycles in Memory of Chaos, 29,714 points in Pure Fiction, and 3,361 points in Apocalyptic Shadow. However, the usage is trash. One guy numbers galore. 0.84% in Memory of Chaos, 0.77% in Pure Fiction, and 1.92% in Apocalyptic Shadow. Given that, just like Ting Yun, it's extremely easy for the overwhelming majority of players to get them at E6, this data is pretty damning about their usage. They too are no longer meta relevant. Now, why do I bring up these examples? Well, as I said way back in this video, one of the primary ways I determine a character's value is by examining the history of metas in Honkai Star Rail as I have observed them. In that, I compare qualities that older units have to newer units to extrapolate how I expect their long-term meta relevance to play out. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And based on history, DDD bots usually suffer slow and agonizing deaths in the meta by 1,000 cuts, either by being directly power crept and or the archetype they were supporting falling out of the meta. Now, for the guy that's yelling in the back, what about Sparkle? I was getting to that. Now, Sparkle is an interesting case. They too were a limited DDD bot, but just like Tribbie, she immediately started getting power crept after Robin came out, although Sparkle's case is way more depressing. Once Sunday came out, Sparkle's hopes and dreams got shattered into a million pieces along with her meta relevance. But what about today? She, fortunately enough, got a partial revive thanks to Archer, an extremely powerful single target unit. An unexpected surprise, but a welcome one. Since Archer is actually meta, so is she. Per Pridewin, she is tier 0.5 in MOC, tier 1 in Pure Fiction, and tier 0.5 in Apocalyptic Shadow. She's also outside the bounds of one guy territory in most modes, as her average usage in Memory of Chaos at E2 with all light cones is 8.82% with 5.06 cycles. In Pure Fiction is 4.92% at 33,810 points. And in AS is 11.58% with a score of 3,569. It's not terrible, but it's pretty mediocre for a limited Harmony unit at E2 specifically. The only place she's not mediocre is in AS, where she's relatively good. Going off of the history of the 3 most notorious DDD spammers of all time, these units either A, became largely meta irrelevant, or B, they remained meta relevant but are clinging to life at being good in one mode and specifically with 1 or 2 units. Obviously, this does not bode well for Tribbie if we pay close attention to history. Obviously, Tribbie is well beyond every single Harmony I've named thus far in overall power, but All of the units discussed had considerable power and utility when they released as well. Ting Yun was one of the GOATs of version 1. The same can be said of Harmony main character in version 2. Even so, without fail, all of these units suffered slow and pitiful falls into mediocrity. Now, maybe Tribbie's situation is unique, and this doesn't happen to her. Maybe it does happen to her, and she gets revived by an unlikely DPS in version 4. From my perspective, history doesn't lie. Based on precedent, the chances that she doesn't also suffer a slow and painful fall into mediocrity is low. The chances that she's suddenly revived once she falls off is even lower. Hopefully, this painfully long history lesson can properly illustrate that being known as a DDD bot, more times than not, is not a great sign for things to come. Moving on to the single target damage.
What? Bro, what are you talking about, man?
I'm not even going to bother explaining why you're wrong about that, so I'm going to let Guoba do it for me.
My problem with Tribbie is if AOE content stops being shielded outside of pure fiction, then her effectiveness will slowly fall. Her damage and energy gains and E1 potential all drop substantially versus single target fights. Sometimes she feels a bit underwhelming, or maybe that's what we just call balanced.
Now, for her damage concentration on E1, there was literally no reason for me to bring that up because, as I've already said a million times, it wasn't relevant at all to my point. I was discussing her flawed kit at E0S0, and everyone knows that. I don't need to acknowledge the E1 overtly to prove that I know that it exists and that I know that it's valuable. I literally played a clip of Goba saying, Tribbie's E1 is unrivaled. Why would I say the same thing that my favorite theory crafter and guide maker already said? Moving on and responding to general arguments, the first one is that Tribbie is the most universal unit in the game. Let me explain why this is actually one of the worst arguments that you could ever use for Tribbie or any team-wide buffer. Additionally, I'll explain why being universally great, or in other words, a jack of all trades, is no longer a desirable quality to have. Genuine question. For anyone who uses this argument, have you had your head in the sand since version 2? Have you guys been paying attention to what the developers have been ramping up since that version? If you said creating archetypes or shilling teams, you would be correct. 100 points for you. Back in version 1, the only 3 archetypes of note were crit-based hypercarries, damage over time, and hodgepodge break teams, with crit-based hypercarries being the best of the 3. Then, in version 2, the developers decided that they had to create identities in this game, archetypes for people to invest in. First, they created Super Break with Harmony main character and shoved that down our throats. Then, they expanded follow-up teams with the release of Fei Xiao and Robin. They created Acheron, who was essentially her own meta. They even tried to revive damage over time with Black Swan. So then, we had crit-based hypercarries, Acheron teams, damage over time teams, follow-up teams, Super Break teams, and hodgepodge summon teams. So, in version 3, what did the devs do? They tripled and quadrupled down. They dropped the Remembrance path, a path that requires a whole new set of light cones. Now, we have even more specific teams within the damn archetypes. It wasn't enough to have premium Fei Xiao and Firefly teams. Oh no, no, no. Now we have Castorize teams and Aglaia teams. They expanded the domain of Erudition teams with the likes of Herda and Anaxa. So let's go over where we're at now. We have crit-based hypercarries, Acheron teams, damage over time teams, follow-up teams, Super Break teams, Remembrance teams, Erudition teams, Finon teams, and then in version 4, we're going to have Elation teams. Tell me, after everything I just said, does it sound like the devs want you, the player, to keep using universal supports? No, right? They're trying to sell you teams now. not just characters. They're selling synergies. Has anyone here played Yu-Gi-Oh? Have you played it recently? Back in the day, the game was simple. It had normal summoning, tribute summoning, special summoning, and ritual summoning. Then what happened? Now it has all of those things, plus synchro summoning, exceed summoning, pendulum summoning, and link summoning. Oh, and I also forgot fusion summoning. All with their own specific supports and mechanics. Why do I make this analogy? Because HSR is going down the Yu-Gi-Oh route. They don't give a flying fuck about making universal units anymore. Tribbie, in all likelihood, was meant to be an erudition unit / pure fiction support and a stand-in until Castorice's full team got released and they goofed. Why do you think that Cyrene has hyper-specific synergy with the Chrysos heirs and isn't the universal buffer that even I thought she was going to be? Teams are the way of the future. The idea of universal supports literally costs the developers money. They know that. For example, if you already own a well-built Ron May, chances are the devs aren't convincing you to pull a Tribbie, even if it has a better amp. It's just cheaper to keep what you already have. They drop 13 new 5-stars with a 14th on the way in one version with the sole purpose of selling teams and light cones, and you're shilling Tribbie's universality. Add in the fact that the devs gave out a Ron May for free, and that seals the deal even further. Why do you guys think they gave Ron May out for free? Why drop a Firefly skin when she's one of the worst DPSs in the game at low investment? Because they're reviving Super Break teams. Even if Constance comes out and replaces Ron May in Super Break teams, the devs know that everyone is going to be spent once version 3.8 comes out. They gave us Ron May, so at the very least, you can participate in the new Super Break era. In all likelihood, Ron May will continue to be one of the GOATs in break teams. Robin will be the GOAT of follow-up teams. Tribbie may be the GOAT of erudition. But the problem with that is that erudition teams are too reliant on the number of enemies to stay relevant. The only place where they are consistently good is pure fiction, and that's the easiest in-game mode. Any units that are good at AoE can 40k that. The only exception to this rule is Anaxa, and I think his strength was a mistake too, given how many times they nerfed his ass in beta. So now not only is he good in AoE scenarios, he also is good in 1 to 2 scenarios as well. And of course, Cyrene will be the GOAT of remembrance teams. They're going to keep changing metas and keep forcing teams and archetypes down our throats for the specific purpose of phasing out the application of universal units and phasing out universal light cones. Universal units will be forced back into their niche where Hoyo wants them because they want you to buy their teams. It's that simple. Gotchas are predatory. This gacha thrives on FOMO. Any misstep in team building the way the devs want you to will be punished with increasingly difficult clears in endgame. So am I saying that being universal is inherently bad quality to have? No. I like Ron May and Robin partially because of that utility. One of the reasons why I'm pulling Cyrene is because of all the utility that she'll have with not only the Chrysos heirs, but with remembrance teams. However, all signs point to the devs phasing out the most universal qualities that many characters have, whether we like it or not. Soon, if your DPS doesn't have the ultra-specific teams to operate at full power with their ultra-specific light cones, like in Castori's teams, your team will become increasingly more mediocre. And you think pushing the shiny new universal harmony to the entire player base is a good idea. Are you paying attention to what's going on? Do you have any self-awareness? I'm done talking about this argument. If you don't get what I'm saying after pointing all that out to you,
Well, then you are lost!
Now, of course, I had to save the best for last. One of the Tribbie Glazer's favorite argument is that Tribbie has the best damage amp in the game. Let me explain why this argument is irrelevant. Let's break down the supposed amp and then talk about it in its entirety. First off, she has 24% res pen. The fact that she has less res pen than Ranmei, a 1.x unit, should be an immediate red flag. They could have chose literally any other number here. 20%, 23%, 27%, 30%. Why specifically 1 less percent than Ranmei, with the only upside of being superior in uptime? That doesn't strike you as strange? You ever consider that maybe they didn't want to make a better universal unit than Ranmei? Now you might say, well, she is a better universal unit than Ranmei. What if I told you she's not? More on that later. Second off, she has 30% vulnerability. Cool. A different debuff that saturates less in current metas and therefore provides greater damage. The only problem is that it seemed out of place in her kit. Then sure enough, 2 patches later, they drop Cipher. Cipher has 40% vulnerability. This is odd. Why give Tribbie vulnerability only to give another unit 10% more vulnerability 2 patches later? Reminder, the devs couldn't be asked to give 1% more res pen than a 1.x unit, but they allow Tribbie to have less vulnerability than a unit that comes out 2 patches later? Not only that, the worst part of all of this is that Cipher has better uptime than Tribbie because her vulnerability is a passive. It requires nothing to activate it. So let me get this straight. Tribbie, the premium top 1 Harmony unit, has what exactly that she's the best at now? She doesn't have the best personal damage as a sub DPS support. Hyacine immediately power crept that, and then Evernight danced on her grave. She doesn't have the most res pen in the game. Ranmei still has that. She doesn't have the most vulnerability in the game. Cipher has that. She doesn't have the best uptime either. Cipher also has that. So what does she have left? Being the most universal unit? I already explained why that's getting phased out. Being a DDD jockey? I already explained why, historically, that's not good either. Providing additional damage? Big whoop. Robin has been doing that since 2.x. Provides true damage at E1? Who cares? We already have Remembrance Trailblazer, who's free and will be getting buffed when Cyrene comes out. Cipher and Cyrene, they have true damage in their base kit at E0. So what's the last thing that Tribbie has that she's absolutely superior at in this game that's not detrimental to her very existence? The total damage amp. That's it. The easiest thing in the world for the developers to power creep. The same damage amp potential that becomes less effective when there are less enemies on the field, as explained by Golba. The power creep that already started with Cipher and is further exacerbated by Evernight. Her amp has already been completely phased out in memo teams by Evernight unless you own Tribbie's E1. You get Evernight's E1 and Tribbie is immediately outclassed. Not only that, Evernight's sub DPS capabilities are far greater. Then Cyrene will replace her as an amplifier on that team. Logically, what is the next course of action? You should know that too. The devs will inevitably drop another unit whose amp is equal to or greater than Tribbie's base amp, and then stack more buffs on top of that. They could even give the character their own personal damage that surpasses Tribbie just to rub salt in the wound, and it wouldn't be surprising in the slightest. Tribbie would be immediately cooked because, again, half her kit is wasted on buffing her personal damage. The only place she'll retain long-term relevance as hinted at by Guoba and further implied by me, is pure fiction. Hence the Jade foreshadowing in my other video. Her damage being universal is irrelevant because the devs are going to force every character into a box to sell their teams. Just because they haven't done that in its entirety to Tribbie yet doesn't mean that it's not coming. I tried to leave breadcrumbs to lead people to this conclusion, but it didn't work. So now we're here. But I have another angle as to why her damage amp is irrelevant, and I'll go over that shortly. Alright, we're finally in the final stretch of the video, and oh my gosh, I am so thankful for that because I am tired as fuck. Going into the next part of this video, as we already went over, one of the primary reasons why Tribbie is valued over units like Ron, May, and Robin is due to her sheer damage amp. As I've already started to explain, that is utterly irrelevant. So let's take this a step further and get to the inevitable conclusion. Let's put ourselves in the shoes of a newer free-to-play player or someone who's been playing the game for 6 months or so. Let's compare Tribbie to Ron May in this scenario. On paper, Tribbie is a better damage amper on most teams in the game. Agreed? Agreed. She's also a more universal option. Agreed? Agreed. However, how effective Tribbie is, in reality, is completely different than a simulation. Do you guys know what is more important than any damage amplifier? The answer is a strong sustain. As a matter of fact, I remember back in the day when theory crafters and guide makers used to always echo, you have to have 2 well-built sustains to clear endgame. Simpler times. Now, why does that matter in this hypothetical? Well, simply put, a new player in this era of HSR can't even dream to get far in in-game content without a proper sustain. As a result, the instant that a new player attempts to complete a new in-game mode, not only do they need to do a lot of damage due to the rapidly increasing HP of the bosses, but they also must kill the boss before the boss kills them. This seems pretty obvious on its face, but you'd be surprised by how many people disregard this simple fact. Now, Tribbie does absolutely fuck all to protect you from elites or a boss. Her personal damage is also predicated on the fact that you built her with optimal substats necessary to deal meaningful damage. Therefore, without having an extremely powerful and well-built sustain, like Hyacine for example, it would be utterly impossible for the average player to clear the increasingly difficult endgame. This is the exact reason why the developers are giving away DHPT for free. They already know that without providing a sustain of his strength, the average player would be even further deterred from challenging the harder content in the game. So how does Ron May alleviate this problem? Well, simply put, Ron May has not only 50% weakness break efficiency, but increased break delay. These two factors dramatically reduces the strain on the sustain in any given team. While these factors can be detrimental to a casterized team, they are applicable everywhere else. Logically, the increasingly most important part of clearing content is becoming less focused on how much damage you can deal, but whether you can survive long enough to do that damage. If the enemy is broken, not only do they take 10% more damage from your DPS, but they also cannot hit you. This gives you time to gather your thoughts, build back your resources, or give you more time to set up an emergency heal you may need in a few turns. One of the reasons why I became good at sustainless clears and zero cycle clears is not because I simply do a lot of damage, or because I pull every shiny new DPS and sustain in every patch. It's because I got good at hitting the enemy without getting hit myself. This is one of the most fundamental principles necessary to succeed in this game, but is often forgotten since it seems obvious to the average player. It doesn't matter how much greater Tribbie's damage amp is than Ron May. Ron May is fundamentally superior for the average player's survivability than Tribbie, especially if they don't own Hyacine. A wise man once said, boards don't hit back. Similarly, damage calculations and simulations do not account for how hard new elites and bosses will be hitting you in the future. Taking away your enemy's turns are just as important as doing damage, something that Tribbie is fundamentally inferior at due to her flawed kit design. This simple fact is lost upon the majority of the community that has become obsessed with damage and has taken for granted the very comfort provided to them by a unit like Ron May. This arrogance and overconfidence is only stripped away when they step back and realize Ron May's full value. Only then will they realize they were fools to discredit her greatness. Ron May, by the way, is not the only team-wide harmony buffer capable of taking away your enemy's turns. Can you guess where I'm going with this one? That's right, Robin can too. She does it in a different way, though, in that she advances your entire team up by 100%. This is critical in allowing your team to not only set up your buffs, but to delay the enemy's setup as well. Robin and Ron May are the only two team-wide buffers in the entire game that not only provide sufficient value via damage amp, but improved survivability at E0 in a way that no other team-wide damage amper can provide. To reiterate, this is because they take away your opponent's turns and thus takes away opportunities for your enemy to kill you. For those who question my rationale, my experience, my logic, go ahead and tell me how Tribbie, from an individual standpoint at E0 S0, is going to help your team go against enemies with higher damage numbers and greater HP pools and rapidly increasing toughness bars. And no, her being glued to Hyacine, hiding behind Caster Ice, or being ejected off the field by Finon are not good answers. How is Tribbie going to help? By helping you kill the enemies faster? And SI5 DDD? Don't make me laugh. The developers are intentionally shifting the meta towards Super Break, once more leading into version 4. Meaning that if your Tribbie can't help your team stay alive long enough to break the enemies you face, you will struggle like never before. By the way, this survivability factor is one of the reasons why I value Cipher in ways that most players do not. I never really explained that, did I? Man, I cannot lie. I love Cipher. I like her a lot. But as I said towards the beginning of the video, I do have legitimate reasons for why I valued her, especially over Tribbie. First, on skill, she weakens the enemies she targets by 10%. This is a pretty rare buff. Don't tell me you guys thought that was random, or did it occur to you that the devs gave that to Cipher because they knew enemies would start hitting harder than ever before? Of course, this weekend isn't life-changing, but it does reduce the load on your sustain more than Tribbie ever will. Second, her uptime. Because her vulnerability is a passive, there's no issues to worry about regarding skill rotations. She has the greatest freedom, skill point economy, of any team-wide buffer because her debuffs are not contingent on her skill or ultimate usage, meaning she is effectively permanently SP positive and her debuffs have little downtime. Lastly, and this is the most important part, her true damage. See, Tribbie's E1 damage is front-loaded, and how effective it is depends on how many enemies there are on the field. Cipher's true damage is backloaded. Not only that, at E1, Cipher gets to record even more damage. This means that Cipher, fundamentally, doesn't care how many enemies are on the field. She only cares how much damage her DPS is doing. Tribbie gives off the appearance of being a loving and caring character in lore, while being a selfish and greedy character in game. She has to be paired with a strong DPS, a strong sustain, and sometimes even another sub DPS to get her full potential. On top of that, she needs to always be fighting 3 to 5 enemies, or her E1 and personal damage take a nosedive. Cipher appears selfish and greedy in lore, while being loving and caring in lore and in game. As long as your DPS is built correctly and does her job, he has your back. You see, not only does Cipher attempt to protect you by weakening the enemy, but she's the best ally to have in increasingly harder content. Tribbie, as we already discussed, has greater amping, but does nothing for your team in terms of survivability. Cipher, on the other hand, provides you greater survivability, and while she doesn't provide better raw amps, she does scale better at increasingly harder content. The larger a boss's health pool, the longer the battle goes on, and the more damage that your team is forced to do to compensate for the bosses getting stronger, the more devastating Cipher's recorded damage becomes. Also, considering how concentrated her ultimate is, even if you can't break the enemy right before they kill you, it doesn't matter. If you're doing consistent damage, you can fire off an ult that disregards their damage reduction and kill them before they kill you. Now, getting back to my goats. Where were we? Right. The seemingly obvious but often forgotten survivability boost that Robin and Ron may provide is eternal. It doesn't matter how much their damage amp gets power crept. They will fundamentally provide better survivability in more team comps than most future team-wide buffers. Why do you guys think I brought up Bailu earlier? A whim? No. Look deeper than that. Connect the dots. Think. Exchange cleanse for damage amp. Replace healing with survivability. Very early on in the game, cleansing was important until the enemies started hitting harder. You can't be cleansed if your team dies. Again, your team cannot avoid getting hit. The same is true of damage amping. Damage amp is important until your team can't deal damage because your healers cannot compensate for the rate at which the enemies are growing in strength. Even though Tribbie is superior to Ron, May, and Robin in sheer damage amp and overall synergies, she is not superior in providing survivability for your team. This is why I spent 10 minutes showing you guys the flaws in Tribbie's kit design compared to every other limited Harmony unit. Not only does she provide effectively no buffs in her base kit, not only is half her goddamn kit wasted on vacuous personal damage, but she provides 0 survivability to the team in her base kit. Again, she provides no HP buffs, no action advances, no break efficiency buffs, no break delay. All she has is a small delay that she gets from entanglement as a byproduct of her element. Again, players with established accounts do not account for this because they automatically assume that the average player will be able to compensate for the ridiculous damage these enemies do and be able to clear endgame when everyone knows that's not true. This is what happens when most players remain in their echo chambers. Tell me, guys, when is the last time you looked at reviews for Honkai Star Rail? Hmm? If I pressed you to tell me the rating of HSR in, let's say, the Google Play Store, could you tell me? You can't? Don't worry, I got you. It's 3.3 stars. Let's read some recent reviews, by the way. So the first one says that it was great in the earlier versions, but the game has reached a point where you're required to pull for and build the latest meta teams in order to clear content, as older characters become obsolete as the versions progress. You can no longer enjoy playing your favorite characters as they're incapable of dealing the necessary damage to defeat enemies in newer content. Next one. The continuous power creep is annoying, mainly because it makes me bored in using older characters, which are the only ones I have, and the new characters that I don't have much more interesting gameplay, which is unfair. The current main quest is kind of boring, and I stopped doing it because it's quite long. Overall, a 5-star if it wasn't for the power creep, and also the lack of new 4 stars is notable. The one after that. What happened to my favorite gacha game? You're not going to have a good time as a casual if you're missing specific, limited characters because of the bloated HP values and how terrible most of the old characters are compared to the new ones, limited or not. The story is also less engaging now. The quality dipped around halfway through Penacony, and while it isn't terrible, it is too dry and too frequent to keep me interested. The game is playable, but isn't worth the time anymore. Those are the most recent critical reviews of the game. Now, what would you tell players like that? Get good? Just pull the newer characters? Disregard all the older units and everything will be fine? Just pull E1 Tribbie and they're good? Reality is not that simple. As I just read out loud to you, HP inflation and power creep is ruining the game for many players. If the enemies start getting larger HP pools while simultaneously getting stronger, battles will go from being 0 cycle showcases and flexing on your enemies to battles of attrition that will increase the strain on your sustains that are becoming rapidly less useful since they can't comfortably keep your team alive. Unless your name is Hyacinth. This is the exact reason, as an example, why I put Ho-Ho in tier 0.5 in my tier list as opposed to tier 0. Her energy generation, cleansing, and damage amping are useful, but all those things stop mattering if your team keeps dying. Now, I already know some jackass is going to say, well, players can just build their sustains better. Oh, wow. What a fucking embodiment of wisdom you are. And that's the exact problem that I'm talking about. These self-absorbed idiots think that things that they were forced to learn after playing the game for over a year or two will naturally come to many players. The reason some players neglect their sustains is because they listen to clowns like this who always talk about damage, damage, and more damage. How do you think that shapes the opinions of players who have no idea what they're doing? They just tunnel vision on DPS and the hot new support and then skip sustains like Hyacinth because they don't see her value. One of the many reasons why most players can't even approach endgame is because they don't know how to build characters. They don't know how to form teams. They don't know the small tricks that players like me know. But the best players who clear endgame regularly assume that everyone will eventually learn the same shit. Hate to burst your bubble, but they don't. They quit. They don't know that you can intentionally allow yourself to get energy by getting hit. They don't know that you can place your characters in a certain way based off internal taunt values to manipulate the characters that they want to get hit. They don't know how to speed tune. Some of them don't even know how to read an action value bar. They don't have it on in the settings. They don't know how to manipulate action values or take advantage of breaking enemies. If you only saw the things that I see on places like Hoyo Lab, players running teams like Acheron, Firefly, Aventurine, and Kafka. Absolutely clueless. So every time players have legitimate issues, those players are often told, skill issue, lil bro. Should have just pulled Tribbie, lil bro. Just pulled a shiny new thing. I say, that's a bad take. Maybe pull Hyacine instead and value characters on a kit-by-kit basis. Get a free Ron May while you're at it. No one really needs Tribbie. You can get by just fine with Ron May. Then the response is, you're only saying that because you're emotionally attached to Ron May and Robin. You're only saying that because you have them both E1 S1, despite the fact that the abilities that grant your team greater safety are available at E0 S0. You're only mad because Tribbie power crept Ron May and Robin. Yeah, I'm mad because idiots like that are saying to not pull or invest in the comfiest team-wide buffers in the game because they're old and their damage amp is weaker than Tribbie's. But those guys who say that, no, they're the intellectuals. They're the intellectuals who think that team-wide buffers are only useful for damage and literally nothing else. And a lot of these players will never get it because they legitimately don't care. They have no skin in the game. If they start to struggle, they just spend more money. Or their account is already completely rounded out and they already know what they're doing. So if their dumbass advice doesn't work out, not their problem. Doesn't affect their bottom line. The worst part of all of this is not only does Tribbie's value wane on the average player's account with inferior sustaining capabilities, but it also wanes in veteran player accounts because players like myself who own E1 S1 Ron May, who own E1 S1 Robin, simply don't need an E1 Tribbie. It doesn't help us negative cycle. We can't get more than 40k in pure fiction. So what would we pull Tribbie for? To get a few extra points in Apocalyptic Shadow? 0 cycle faster? 40k with multiple teams? Who cares? We're all getting the same number of J's regardless. For most players, Tribbie's only long-lasting contribution might be to A, let them more easily clear pure fiction, and or B, guarantee that players have a third support for anomaly arbitration. But guess what? You can't reach anomaly arbitration without 3-starring all the other in-game modes first. And you know who will become increasingly more required in order to do that? You know the answer. Not just strong sustains like DHPT and Hyacine, but none other than the most underrated and taken for granted units of all time, Robin and Ron May. Unfortunately, self-absorbed, permanently online players will just give out terrible blanket advice to not invest in Robin and Ron May. Because Ron May and Robin's era is over. Tribbie ended it. You didn't get the memo? These players fundamentally do not understand that every player's circumstance is completely different, and most players need individualized advice that will be helpful to them. In conclusion, I do not trust Tribbie because her kit is fundamentally flawed. A Harmony that has half their kit tied up with personal damage has little to no room for improvement. Her damage amping is utterly worthless in most cases because better amplifiers will appear in short order as they always have. Her damage amplification in memo teams for the millionth time got power crept in 7 months by Evernight, and it's only a matter of time before her universal capabilities become irrelevant as well. Her personal damage is utterly worthless as she started getting power crept by a mere healer within a couple months of her release. Not only did her damage get power crept, but Tribbie is being held up on crutches by Hyacine's HP buffs to survive and do more damage while Hyacine does not need Tribbie. While Tribbie may be able to clear endgame now without requiring cracked sustains, in the near future, that will change. But hey, maybe her big HP pool will be relevant in taking the hit in the new Super Break oriented boss. At least you can cling to that, right? Evernight has already stolen Tribbie's best partner by providing a better amp to Hyacine. Tribbie has no answer to the rapidly increasing HP inflation and damage inflation that new elites and bosses will have, and she will be increasingly more forced to cling for dear life to every premium sustain that comes out to avoid being crushed in increasingly harder endgame. Ron and Robin will never have any such issue because they have inherent advantages in their kit that A, takes away your opponent's turns, and B, gives your team more turns to act. Combined with having access to the same sustain synergies that Tribbie has, while providing more buffs and greater survivability, and their value is unrivaled in the game. Therefore, I have concluded that Tribbie's overall value is less than that of established units like Robin and Ron May, and I predict that Tribbie's falloff will be quiet, slow, and painful. For all the reasons I provided, I do not believe that she was a valid long-term investment for most players. Even if Cyrene doesn't outright provide better damage and universality than Tribbie, it's not relevant. Cyrene gives direct buffs to DHPT and Hyacine, two of the best sustains in the game, and improves their sustain capabilities. This alone makes Cyrene another unit that can provide additional survival capabilities that Tribbie can't do. Tribbie will either get filtered out of the meta or will be filtered out by the stronger enemies and HP inflation that are rapidly approaching. I thank everyone who provided me valid criticism and challenged me to be more convincing in my arguments. I thank all those who shared my video in hopes to dislike Brigade my channel. I thank all those who commented on my videos with derision towards my ideas and forced me to sharpen them. With all that said, I rest my case. To reiterate, Tribbie's value is inferior to two of the best team-wide buffers in the game and will fall off more rapidly than them. Furthermore, her amp has been power crept faster than any team-wide buffer that has come out before her and will continue to be power crept in the future. And once her damage amp is power crept in its entirety, it is highly likely that she will become the Jade of Amplifiers, meaning she will be a pure fiction jockey. To be ultra clear, yes, I am saying that Damage Amp plus built-in survivability features is better than just a Damage Amp. Full stop. End of story. Not arguing with anybody about it. I will be following up on my prediction in 6 months' time to see if I was right or wrong. To be clear, before anyone puts words in my mouth, as always, I have never, ever suggested that Tribbie was a bad or useless unit. Only that her kit is extremely flawed and her value limited. There are two possible blind spots in my assessment that could upend my predictions altogether. The first is her value in elation comps once 4.x comes out. The second is Cyrene, as she will provide a specific buff to Tribbie that could extend her lifespan. As always, if I'm wrong about Tribbie, I'll just adjust my methodologies further to improve the accuracy of my predictions. I've done it before, and I'll do it again. A wise man wants to be corrected. Anyone who wants to replace error with truth is wise. Now I speak directly to the Tribbie sycophants who think that she can do no wrong and that her damage amp is the end all be all for team wide buffers. And to be clear, I am not referring to the commentators I responded to earlier or anyone who just gave me constructive criticism. All of you guys are cool. I appreciate you guys. Genuinely. Thank you again. For you who spread their sycophantic praise about Tribbie while ignoring all the factors that I brought out throughout this video, pray that I'm wrong. To be clear, I don't care if I'm wrong regardless, because I'm not reliant on Tribbie and DDD to clear content. I was also very clear that I could be wrong about Tribbie, which is the reason why I cite Globa, a theory crafter and guide maker with much greater knowledge than myself. That's why I say to follow your own vision and don't use me as your only source of information. Players who have chosen to invest in Robin and Ruame will continue to survive and thrive amongst an ever-changing meta landscape. So if I'm incorrect here, it holds no consequence for anyone. But if you sycophants are wrong, you have to live with the consequences of giving an incomplete analysis about a character to impressionable players who fundamentally don't understand that damage amp, attack frequency, better uptime, and DDD become increasingly less relevant when you consider that the more powerful the units and the teams in this game become, this causes a ripple effect that increases the devastating power of the all-encompassing black tide of Honkai Star Rail that comes in 3 waves: HP inflation, toughness bar inflation, and damage inflation. Survivability, on the other hand, never, ever loses relevance. Bailu says hi. Because whether you like it or not, in the very near future, you'll be struggling to survive. And when you are, unless you're going to grab your credit card as always and enter the funny 3 digits on the back and pull for the shiny toy to save you and your account, just remember that your lords and saviors that have given you relief and comfort for a combined 1,100 and 47 plus days will always be there to bail your ass out. As always. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to me, and then subscribe to Globus Certified. Your boy Ars is out.